after I had the difficult conversation with my daughter, Betty, and shared the news that I had been diagnosed with cancer. Her immediate reaction was not what any mother might have expected. There were no tears, no expression of shock or sadness. Instead, she simply smiled and remarked, in a tone that was almost cheerful, "At least you'll leave us the house." I can recall every single detail of that moment, etching itself into my memory with painful clarity. I remember exactly where I was standing, or rather, sitting. The kitchen was still filled with the comforting, sweet aroma of cinnamon rolls. I had spent that very morning baking them from scratch, pouring my energy into the familiar process, clutching onto the hope that this small act of routine might bring some sense of normalcy back into a world that felt suddenly, drastically abnormal. The scent lingered in the air as I waited at the kitchen table, my eyes fixed on the clock, trying desperately to regulate my breathing, which had become shallow and ragged. My hands were visibly trembling, so I pressed them firmly against the warm ceramic mug I held, using its steady heat as an anchor, trying to ground myself in the physical sensation. Betty entered the kitchen, her phone already in her hand, her gaze barely lifting from the screen. Lately, she seemed to be in perpetual motion, always rushing, busy with her demanding real estate career, busy adjusting to her new marriage, busy cultivating the image of someone important and indispensable. But she did come when I asked her to, which was something I rarely did these days, preferring not to impose on her packed schedule. "Everything okay, Mom?" she asked quickly, finally glancing up for a split second before looking back down at an incoming text message. "You sounded weird on the phone." I managed a small, perhaps shaky, nod and gestured for her to take a seat. She raised an eyebrow, a fleeting expression of mild curiosity, then placed her phone on the counter with deliberate care before pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. For a brief, suspended second, her eyes met mine. In that fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of the little girl she used to be, the one whose long hair I carefully braided each morning, the one who held my hand tightly at the dentist's office and whispered fierce promises that she would protect me if any monsters ever dared to appear. And then, I delivered the 3 words that felt heavier than anything I had ever lifted. "I have cancer." 3 simple, unambiguous words. Yet they landed between us with the force of a physical blow. I braced myself, waiting for something. A sharp intake of breath, a tear welling up, even just a stunned silence. Instead, Betty merely blinked, leaned back in her chair slightly, and let out a sharp exhale. "Oh," she said, and I waited, my heart pounding, for the inevitable follow-up, the expression of concern or sympathy. It came, but twisted in a way I could never have anticipated. "At least," she repeated, her voice picking up a strange, almost giddy lightness. "At least you'll leave us the house." And then, she smiled. That was the precise instant when something inside me fractured, splintering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. It wasn't the terrifying diagnosis itself that caused the most profound pain at that moment. It was that smile. The way she uttered those words, framing them as a positive aspect, a silver lining to my impending mortality. It was as if she saw me not as her mother, facing a life-threatening illness, but as a package finally being unwrapped, revealing the valuable contents within, contents she felt entitled to. And in that single, searing second, a stark, undeniable realization washed over me. A truth so brutal it should have crushed me entirely. But instead, it served as a jarring, painful wake-up call in the eyes of my own daughter. I was worth more dead than alive. I should have reacted instantly. I should have spoken the words that clawed at my throat. Should have told her how incredibly cold her comment felt. How it scraped against the raw, exposed walls of my chest. But I didn't. I couldn't. I simply nodded, my gaze falling to my hands, which were still wrapped tightly around that warm ceramic mug. The irony was a bitter twist. It was the same mug she had proudly painted for me on Mother's Day, a decade earlier, back when her love was expressed through sticky fingers and endearingly crooked heart shapes. After that jarring exchange, Betty did talk. She launched into a practical discussion about potential treatment options, spoke about how strong she knew I was, how I would probably beat it. But her eyes, I noticed, kept drifting away from mine, scanning the room, lingering on the walls, the antique china cabinet that had been in my family for generations, the beautiful hardwood floors I had painstakingly paid for years ago with extra tutoring hours and grueling summer jobs. That night, long after she had left and the house settled into a profound quiet, I sat alone and allowed the weight of her words and her look to sink in. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't pepper you with questions. Instead, it brutally provides all the answers you desperately wished weren't true. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs, a heavy, physical presence, and whispers. She's already moved on. In her mind. She's already moved in. Sleep was an impossible luxury that night. I wandered through the house, barefoot, my footsteps silent on the floors. I touched each piece of furniture, each familiar object, with a tenderness that felt like a farewell. I paused in the hallway where Betty used to run, her laughter echoing, dressed in imaginary princess gowns. I pressed my fingers against the bathroom mirror, remembering the steamy hearts she used to draw there after her baths. Every single room held a memory, a tangible echo of a life we had built together. Every wall seemed to whisper with the laughter I had foolishly believed would last forever. But now, it was just me. Me. And the relentless ticking of the clock, which seemed louder, more insistent than ever before. The strange thing was, the cancer itself didn't truly terrify me. Not in the deepest sense. I had faced worse. I had buried a beloved husband far too young, survived soul-crushing layoffs, and raised a daughter entirely on a single, often precarious income. I knew how to do hard things. I was built for resilience. What truly scared me was the dawning, sickening idea that I had poured my entire life, my energy, my very essence, into raising a child who ultimately saw me not as a mother, worthy of love and care in her own right, but merely as an asset, a means to securing a mortgage-free future, a name on a property deed. And for the very first time in years, a defiant, rebellious thought formed in my mind. Maybe I don't want to die in this house. Maybe I don't want to leave it to someone who seems to value the floor plan and potential resale value more than the countless footsteps, memories, and moments that lived within these walls. Maybe, just maybe, I want to truly live before my time comes. So, in the quiet stillness of that sleepless night, I made a decision, quietly, firmly. A decision that required no one's permission but my own. I wasn't going to wait for death to provide my daughter with a gift. I was going to give one to myself, right now, while I was still here and capable of enjoying it. Before all this unfolded, before the unsettling diagnosis, before the smile that undid me more thoroughly than any bad news ever could, my life had settled into a quiet, contented fullness. I resided in a small, gentle, sun-washed town in South Carolina, a place where the long summers felt endless and where neighbors still offered a friendly wave as they drove by. My days had fallen into a soft, comforting rhythm of routine, and my nights were accompanied by the steady hum of crickets outside my window and the familiar, reassuring creak of the old floorboards upstairs. After retiring from my long career teaching high school English, I believed, with quiet satisfaction, that I had finally earned the right to slow down, to find rest and peace. And for a time, I truly did. My house, the very one Betty now seemed to view primarily as her inevitable inheritance, was far more than just wood and drywall to me. It was in my heart, a living scrapbook crafted from architecture, a tangible collection of my life story. Every single room held a narrative. The pale blue walls in the kitchen, for instance, were painted on a sudden, impulsive whim one summer afternoon after I spilled a full cup of coffee and found myself laughing about it rather than succumbing to frustration. The garden in the backyard, which had started as nothing more than a neglected patch of stubborn weeds, had gradually been transformed into my personal sanctuary. I had planted the vibrant azaleas with my bare hands, ignoring the ache in my bad back. I had watched them bloom year after year, stubbornly bright and resilient, even during periods when my life felt anything but. I had built this life, piece by painstaking piece, largely on my own. I hadn't always been alone, of course. My beloved husband, Philip, had passed away tragically, and suddenly, when Betty was only 7 years old, it was a heart attack, swift and cruel in its unexpectedness. One moment, he was laughing across the dinner table about my slightly overcooked pot roast. The next, he had collapsed onto the floor, my hands fumbling desperately with the telephone as I tried to call for help. After that devastating loss, everything in my life shifted dramatically. I became mother, father, provider, nurse, teacher. I wore every hat required, and not once did I complain or feel resentful because I had Betty. She became the central reason for everything I did, my sole focus. I gave her the bigger bedroom. I always insisted she take the last piece of pie. I skipped vacations, putting the money towards saving for things like her braces. I took on extra tutoring jobs, exhausting myself after long school days, so that I could afford to send her to a good college. Not just any college, but the specific one she had circled in a magazine with stars and hearts when she was just 12 years old. I cheered her on enthusiastically when she obtained her real estate license, even as I felt the first subtle pangs of her pulling away from me, busy with clients, busy with her new fiancé, busy with the accelerating pace of her own life. Even then, I felt a deep sense of pride in her accomplishments. I told myself, she doesn't need me anymore. That means I must have done something right. She would still visit sometimes, although the visits grew shorter and less frequent over time. Sundays were nominally ours, even if the time we spent together dwindled. She would often bring takeout food, then spend most of the meal scrolling through her phone at the table, talking animatedly about escrow accounts and sales commissions. I listened attentively, truly listened, even when she rarely, if ever, asked about me or my life. I would sometimes try to introduce topics, books I was reading, a show I had started watching, and she would offer a polite smile and a brief nod before steering the conversation back to her own world of real estate transactions. I rationalized this behavior to myself constantly. I told myself this was normal. This was just what adulthood looked like, that she did love me, just perhaps in a different, more distant way now. I convinced myself that her increasing distance wasn't personal, that her apparent lack of interest in my quiet life wasn't a form of cruelty, but simply a consequence of her overwhelming busyness. After all, hadn't I raised her to be independent, to chase success with fierce determination, to live a life that was loud and fast rather than quiet and soft like mine? Still, a part of me ached, a persistent, dull pain. When she would leave abruptly before dessert was finished, or when she forgot my birthday until I gently reminded her, or when she offered a perfunctory, "You'll be fine, you're tough," instead of offering a comforting hug when I confided in her about the passing of a dear neighbor. But I forgave it. I always did, because she was mine, my Betty, my only child. And I felt an unconditional bond that seemed to supersede everything else. In those quiet, relatively peaceful months leading up to my diagnosis, I made a conscious effort to convince myself that I had done everything right. I had successfully raised a strong, capable, and seemingly successful woman. I had managed to keep the house, paid off the mortgage entirely through my own efforts, and maintained it meticulously with my own hands. I had built a life filled with friends, kind neighbors, and a consistent schedule that gave structure to my days. I volunteered diligently at the local library every Tuesday. I dedicated time to helping a local woman read through classic literature after her husband passed away. I faithfully brought my homemade banana bread to the community center every second Friday. A small act of connection. From the outside, my life appeared steady, solid, built to last. But deep within me, something had already begun to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Like a hairline crack forming in a building's foundation that no one notices until the walls visibly start to lean. Because as much as I tried to tell myself that I was content, something always felt subtly incomplete. Not broken in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. Just a soft, persistent hum of being forgotten, of being useful to others but not truly needed, present in the world but not truly seen, loved perhaps, but seemingly with unspoken conditions attached. And I told myself repeatedly that this was acceptable, that I was lucky, that some people didn't even have this much connection or stability. I clung fiercely to my daily rituals, my morning tea enjoyed on the porch as the sun rose, the comforting scent of soil and sunshine clinging to my gardening gloves, the simple act of folding laundry while humming old jazz songs. The predictable rhythm of routine made the silence in the house bearable, the persistent ache in my heart a little quieter. But all of that, the morning tea, the sanctuary of the garden, the endless forgiveness I offered, was before the frightening doctor's appointments, before the terrifying test results arrived, before Betty's smile cut through me like a sharp knife wrapped in deceptively soft silk. I had built a quiet life and, for so long, had convinced myself it was enough. I didn't know then that the diagnosis of cancer wouldn't be the thing that ultimately dismantled me. It would be the devastating realization that I had, perhaps, lived most of my life for people who saw me as temporary, as replaceable, as someone who would eventually fade away, leaving behind only assets. I didn't know yet that something dormant, something powerful, was about to awaken inside me. Looking back now, with the perspective that distance and time provide, I realized the first real warning sign didn't come in the form of a harsh word or an overt act of neglect. It came in a look. It was late summer, one of those oppressively humid days when the air hangs heavy and thick on your skin, and the incessant drone of the cicadas seems to go on for hours without relief. Betty had stopped by unexpectedly after showing a few properties nearby. She had a bundle of keys clutched in one hand, her sunglasses in the other, and a Bluetooth earpiece still tucked into her ear, even though it wasn't actively connected to a call. She wore her professionalism now like a suit of armor, always giving the impression of rushing somewhere important, always seeming only half present in the current moment. "Just needed a cold drink and some AC," she announced, breezing into the house with the hurried air of a guest rather than a daughter returning home. I poured her a tall glass of iced tea, and we sat for a few minutes at the kitchen island. She looked around the room slowly, appraisingly. It wasn't with the warm, nostalgic gaze of someone recalling childhood dinners or joyful Christmas mornings spent in this space. It was with the slow, calculating assessment of a seasoned realtor evaluating a potential property. Her eyes moved deliberately from the crown molding along the ceiling to the polished marble countertops, then to the windows, evaluating the natural light. Her mouth curved into something that might have been intended as a smile, but felt more like a professional assessment. "You know, Mom," she began, tapping her fingernail lightly against the glass of her tea glass. "This place could sell for a fortune right now." I let out a small, slightly awkward chuckle, not quite sure how else to respond to such a comment spoken in my own kitchen. "Well, I'm certainly not planning on moving anytime soon," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. She leaned forward then, resting her arms on the cool granite countertop. "I'm just saying," she persisted, "with the market being what it is, you'd be set. You could even get something smaller, much more manageable. You know," she added, her voice softening slightly, though the underlying practicality remained. "Fewer stairs, maybe closer to the hospital. Just in case. Just in case." The phrase hung in the air. It was the first time she had ever openly referenced the possibility of me being old, fragile, potentially needing closer medical care in a way that suggested a future without this house, without my current life. I tried to wave it off with a dismissive smile and quickly steered the conversation onto a different topic. I asked her how her open house had gone, whether she and Nate were still planning their trip to Charleston. I attempted to guide the conversation back into the safe, predictable territory of routine and familiar plans. But that look she had given the house, I couldn't shake it. The look as if she were walking through it not as my child, but as a potential inheritor, as if she were mentally peeling back the familiar wallpaper and replacing it with something more modern, as if she were already measuring the space with the blueprint of a future that simply didn't include me. At the time, I convinced myself that it was nothing significant. She was just being practical, I reasoned. That was her nature now. Efficient, organized, relentlessly focused on logistics and outcomes. Perhaps she genuinely believed she wanted what was truly best for me, a smaller house requiring less upkeep, lower property taxes, a more manageable life as I got older. But it wasn't just that single comment. Later that same week, she called and offered, quite unexpectedly, to help me go through the attic. "You know," she said, her voice businesslike. "Declutter. Prep for the future." I initially felt a flicker of hope, thinking she might actually want to spend some quality time with me, sifting through old memories. Instead, she showed up armed with stacks of labeled plastic bins and approached the task with ruthless efficiency, asking questions like, "Do you really need to keep this dusty old vase?" Or, chillingly, "What's your plan for all these books when you're not around?" When you're not around? She uttered the phrase so casually, as if discussing weekend plans or the weather forecast. I laughed it off again. Of course. That was my ingrained habit smoothing over moments of discomfort, attempting to cover up underlying tension with polite smiles and quick changes of subject. But something about those conversations lingered, settling deep within me. Not because they were overtly cruel. Betty wasn't cruel in a malicious way. She never raised her voice, never said anything you could point to specifically as intentionally hurtful. But there was an unsettling undertone, a subtle but definite shift in the way she spoke to me, as if I were already beginning to fade, as if she had stopped seeing me as someone with years left to live and started viewing me merely as a loose end that needed to be efficiently tied up. And I wasn't imagining it. At dinner the following Sunday, she and Nate stopped by unannounced, though they were always welcome. I had prepared her favorite meal, a pot roast, although she barely touched it. She wandered into the dining room, her focus elsewhere, and made a casual, offhand comment. "We'll probably turn this into an office when the time comes." She didn't even seem to realize the significance or implications of what she had just said, until she looked up and saw me staring at her. Frozen. There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes. Perhaps embarrassment, or maybe just a fleeting recognition of my shock. But she quickly shrugged it off and gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before leaving early, citing a busy schedule. "Love you, Mom. Don't stress," she called out casually as she walked out the door. I stood there long after she had left, alone in that dining room, the air still warm and fragrant from the oven, the pot roast untouched on the table. My place at the head of the table suddenly feeling profoundly temporary. It wasn't just the specific words she said, it was how she said them, with an air of practiced ownership, as if she had already skipped ahead to the final chapter of my life story, eager to begin her own. That was the first undeniable red flag, waving clearly in front of me. And I ignored it because, for better or worse, that's often what mothers do. We make excuses. We minimize. We keep hoping. Grief doesn't always arrive with a sudden, shattering impact, like a tidal wave crashing onto the shore. Sometimes, it leaks in slowly, subtly, through the unseen seams of a relationship, small, persistent, and silent. After that jarring comment about repurposing the dining room into an office, I began to notice more of these subtle absences, these empty spaces where genuine love and connection used to reside. At first, I continued to make excuses for her behavior. She was busy, I told myself. She was newly married, adjusting to a new life. Real estate, I knew, was a fiercely competitive and demanding world. I understood. Or at least I desperately wanted to understand. I told myself sternly not to be so sensitive, so needy. She did text me every now and then. She did answer when I called. That's what mattered. Wasn't it staying in touch? Maintaining the connection? However tenuous. But there was something else. Something heavier and more insidious settling between us. A growing emotional distance that wasn't merely physical separation. After my diagnosis, the initial few days blurred into a chaotic haze, the kind where time folds in on itself and loses all meaning. There were a flurry of urgent phone calls, daunting appointments, uncomfortable blood work, and a confusing barrage of medical terms I had to surreptitiously Google in the hospital parking lot because the doctor had rattled them off too quickly to process. In the midst of this overwhelming whirlwind, I called Betty to share the news. I didn't expect her to break down crying, but I thought, perhaps foolishly, that she would at least ask how I was feeling, if I was scared, if I needed anything emotionally. Instead, her response was clinically practical. She immediately asked for my oncologist's name and inquired if I needed assistance organizing a comprehensive care plan. She offered to look into the complex process of filing insurance claims. Not once did she ask if I was afraid of what lay ahead. The following week, she came over, armed not with comfort or support, but with a manila folder overflowing with paper's life insurance information. My will, the property deed to the house. "I know this is hard, Mom," she said, flipping through the forms with detached efficiency. "But it's really better to be prepared. You don't want to leave a mess behind for us. Leave a mess." I sat across from her, rendered speechless by her pragmatic detachment, staring at her perfectly polished nails and the expensive watch on her wrist, which likely cost more than my first car had. I felt reduced, diminished, like a spreadsheet, a checklist item, a financial liability to be managed. I managed a polite nod and whispered, "Thank you." Then, I excused myself, claiming I needed to use the bathroom and lock the door behind me. I didn't cry. I simply stared at my reflection in the mirror, a pale, drawn face staring back, and wondered with a chilling certainty when I had stopped being her mother, the source of unconditional love and support, and had instead become her exit plan, a logistical problem to be solved. Weeks passed, each one stretching longer than the last. I made a concerted effort to keep myself busy, desperately trying to fill the emptiness and distract myself from the encroaching fear and loneliness. I journaled my thoughts and feelings. I took long, aimless walks around the neighborhood. I baked comfort food for my neighbors. finding solace in the familiar rhythm of measuring and mixing. Anything, absolutely anything, to create the illusion that my life wasn't slowly but inexorably shrinking around me. I mentioned to Betty that I wanted to go wig shopping together. A small thing, perhaps trivial in the grand scheme of things, but something that felt significant and emotionally important to me as I anticipated losing my hair. She said she would try to fit it in the following week, but then proceeded to reschedule twice, offering flimsy excuses. When I finally went alone, a kind saleswoman helped me find a wig that closely resembled my old hairstyle's soft brown hair with gentle curls. I took a photo of myself wearing it, sent it to Betty, hoping for some small word of encouragement or affection. Her reply arrived 2 hours later, a short, dismissive text message. "Looks nice. Way better than those old perms you used to get. Lol." I didn't respond. It wasn't just the things she said, or the casual way she said them. It was the growing, undeniable sense that I had simply ceased to exist in her world, unless there was a document requiring my signature or a financial account needing review. She stopped asking about the books I was reading, a shared passion we once had. She completely forgot that I had joined a cancer support group, a lifeline for me. She didn't seem to notice that I had stopped gardening, that the beloved azaleas in the backyard, my source of stubborn beauty, were wilting and neglected. And I, in turn, noticed everything. That's what happens. I realized, when you feel invisible, you become hyper-aware, a silent observer of your own fading presence. You start to measure the silence, to hear what is not being said, the gaping voids in conversation and connection. One day, driven by a desperate need for human connection, I called her just to talk, with no specific reason or request. I simply needed to hear a voice that remembered me as something more than a diagnosis, a checklist, a future asset. Betty answered, her voice clearly distracted, background noise audible. "Hey, Mom, I've actually got another call coming in, too. What's up?" she asked quickly. "Oh, nothing really," I replied, my voice flat. "Just checking in." There was a beat of awkward silence, and then, even more quickly, she said, "Okay. Well, I'll call you later then. Love you." She didn't call. That night, sitting alone in my favorite chair, the silence pressing in, I realized with a chilling clarity that I didn't even feel angry anymore. The anger had somehow dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of being faded, like a photograph, left out in the sun for too long, its colors bleached and dulled. My presence in her life had become muted, indistinct. I was no longer the center of her world, not even a significant figure in the frame. I kept repeating the old mantra to myself. I raised her to be strong, independent. But strength without a foundation of compassion, I realized with a heavy heart, isn't true strength at all. It's merely coldness, a defensive shell, and independence. Genuine independence. Shouldn't mean forgetting or dismissing the hands that held you up when you were too small or weak to stand on your own. I began to notice, with painful precision, how often she would call when she needed something specific. A document I held, a signature on a form, assistance with her complicated taxes. But how rarely, almost never, She asked how I was sleeping, or if I was afraid of what the future held. What came next? One day, I saw she had posted a series of photos on social media showcasing a self-care weekend at a luxurious spa resort. It was, I realized with a jolt, the exact same weekend I had undergone my first demanding chemotherapy session. She hadn't offered to come with me, hadn't even asked if I wanted company. I hadn't told her not to. I hadn't needed to. The expectation simply wasn't there. I sat in the sterile infusion chair alone, listening to the low hum of the machines keeping me alive, watching a couple across the room, a mother and daughter. The daughter held her mother's hand throughout the entire session. They barely spoke, but their silence felt full, rich with unspoken support and love. Mine was simply empty. That was the slow, relentless drip, not of the chemotherapy drugs entering my veins, but of being erased bit by bit, moment by agonizing moment, until one day I understood with terrifying certainty that she didn't truly see me anymore. Not the real me, not the whole me, and perhaps, just perhaps, in the process of being overlooked and undervalued for so long, I had started to forget who I was myself. It happened during a Sunday dinner. But this time, Betty had unexpectedly offered to host at her house. It was a surprise, considering how often she claimed to be too swamped with work to even think about cooking a meal. I was initially touched by the gesture. She even asked me what my favorite dish was. Roast chicken. I had told her. Simple. Familiar. Comforting. The taste of home. When I arrived at her house, it was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. White marble floors gleamed under sleek pendant lights. Minimalist decor adorned the walls, and stainless steel appliances shone like polished mirrors. It felt less like walking into a lived-in home and more like stepping into a high-end showroom. Still, I had brought flowers, a small peace offering. I wore a nice blouse and even put on makeup, despite my skin's pallor from the treatments. Even though my physical appearance reflected the toll of my illness, I wanted to feel like myself, like I still belonged somewhere, had a place at the table of life. Betty greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek. Her husband, Nate, barely looked up from his phone, offering a mumbled greeting. I smiled and took my assigned seat at the dining table. It was long, glossy, and clearly expensive, a centerpiece of modern design. I glanced around the room. There were no cluttered family photos displayed, no silly magnets stuck to the refrigerator, nothing soft or sentimental that hinted at a shared history or personal warmth. We ate the meal. The roast chicken was dry and lacked flavor. Betty chatted non-stop about interest rates and closing costs. Nate complained loudly about a buyer who had backed out at the last minute. I listened. I nodded at appropriate intervals. I attempted, tentatively, to inject a story or two into the conversation, something light-hearted from my support group meeting, a funny anecdote about a nurse at the clinic. But each time I spoke, the conversation seemed to immediately pivot away, like my words had no weight, no significance in their world. And then, somewhere between the bland mashed potatoes and the store-bought dessert, Betty said it. She spoke the words completely casually, without warning, without any apparent malice in her voice. Just a striking, matter-of-fact detachment. Well, when Mom's gone, At least we'll have the house to soften the blow. I stopped chewing immediately, the food turning to ash in my mouth. Nate chuckled nearby. "Yeah, seriously," he chimed in, his tone equally casual. "That place is going to be a gold mine. I mean, it's practically paid off." "Right," Betty nodded, taking a sip of her wine, confirming the financial details of my impending death. "Yep, all equity, all ours. It'll definitely take care of things." They were speaking as if I weren't even present, as if I had already faded into a distant memory, as if I were merely a passive guest attending the reading of my own will. I looked across the table at Betty, my only child, the baby I had rocked through countless fevers, the little girl who had cried inconsolably when her first goldfish died. Her eyes were calm, her posture relaxed, completely at ease. She didn't flinch, didn't look at me, didn't seem to realize, or perhaps didn't care, that her words had just sliced me clean open. "I'm still here," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room's transactional chatter. The conversation abruptly ceased. The room went quiet. Betty blinked, as if just noticing my presence again. "I know, Mom. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, you know, practical stuff. There's no point in pretending. Pretending! That's what she thought I was doing. Pretending to still matter. Pretending to be fully present and alive. Inconveniently clinging to a life she was already planning around." I pushed my plate away from me. My stomach churned violently, but not from the dry chicken. It was from something much deeper, older. A visceral reaction to a kind of betrayal that doesn't come from strangers, only from those you have given everything to. I stood up quietly from the table. Betty looked confused, her brow furrowed. Nate calmly sipped his beer, seemingly oblivious to the emotional earthquake happening. I smoothed the wrinkles from my blouse, taking a moment to compose myself, and said, my voice steady despite the internal turmoil, "Thank you for dinner." "Oh, come on, Mom. Don't be so dramatic," Betty said, setting down her fork with an exasperated sigh. "I was just being honest." That was the moment the truth crystallized for me, sharp and clear. Honesty without empathy, I stated, looking directly at her, is just cruelty disguised as logic. Without another word, I turned and walked out of her house. When I arrived back at my own house, I sat in the car in the driveway for a full 20 minutes before I could bring myself to go inside. The house itself was dark, quiet, and felt strangely welcoming. I stepped into the living room and dropped my keys onto the entry table. The same worn antique table Philip and I had found and fallen in love with at a flea market when we were just starting our lives together. I stood there in the quiet darkness and finally cried. Not loud, racking sobs, not dramatic wails, just slow, steady tears that streamed down my face, soaking into my skin and falling onto the hardwood floors that Betty was so eager to refinish and claim as her own. I wasn't grieving the cancer diagnosis at that moment. I was grieving the deeply held story I had told myself for years. The story that my daughter loved me fiercely, unconditionally, that all the countless sacrifices I had made for her truly meant something profound, that when my world inevitably grew smaller, she would be the one sitting beside me, holding my hand. Instead, she was already reaching past me, reaching impatiently for paperwork, for property deeds, for the tangible assets of my life. And in that crushing moment, I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had changed between us, something that could not be unmade or undone. The physical pain of the illness was one burden, the pain of being rendered irrelevant, of being spoken about entirely in the past tense, while I was still very much alive and breathing, was a wound of a different, equally devastating kind. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it shattered something essential deep inside me just the same. After that dreadful dinner, something fundamental inside me simply turned silent. Not the kind of silence that desperately begs for attention, that cries out to be filled or comforted. This was the kind of silence that settles, low and final, like dust on a closed piano that will never be played again. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I didn't send Betty a furious text message explaining the depth of the wound her words had inflicted. I simply stopped expecting anything from her. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet. Betty didn't call, and I made no effort to reach out to her. There was no dramatic fallout, no confrontation, no apology offered or demanded. Just a vast, empty space opening up between us. And in that silent space, I began to notice how profoundly empty things had already become. Not only in the chasm that had opened between my daughter and me, but deep inside myself as well. I walked through my house like a ghost, my body moving through the familiar routines, folding towels, watering the neglected plants, rearranging books on the shelves. But my heart felt detached, absent. For the first time since receiving my cancer diagnosis, I began to question what I was even holding on to. This house, this tangible representation of my life's work, had once been my greatest source of pride and security. I had clung to it fiercely after Philip died, worked grueling overtime hours to make every single mortgage payment on my own, patched the roof myself when I couldn't afford to hire a contractor. Every picture frame on the wall, every lamp, every small dent in the hardwood floor held a story, a memory, a piece of my history. But now, it simply felt like a museum of sacrifices that no one, especially Betty, seemed to remember or value. To her, it was merely an asset, a backup plan, something to be efficiently converted into cash once I was gone. One morning, about a week after that awful, silent dinner, she showed up at my door unannounced. Her tone was unusually bright and cheerful, unsettlingly so. She brought me a coffee from my favorite local cafe and sat down at the kitchen table as if absolutely nothing significant had happened between us. "I've been thinking, Mom," she said, tapping her manicured nails against the lid of the coffee cup. "You should really put the house in my name now. I mean, it would avoid a whole lot of legal mess later on, probate and all that." I blinked, taken aback by her blunt request. "Excuse me," I managed to say, feeling my throat tighten. She leaned in conspiratorially, speaking as if this were merely a helpful suggestion she had read about in a lifestyle magazine. "It's smart, Mum. Believe me. That way, if something happens." She paused delicately. "There's no probate court, no delays. I can take care of everything immediately. Just like that. And you still get to live here. Of course, nothing changes for you." She smiled, a wide, practiced smile, as if she had just solved a complicated puzzle for my benefit. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I placed my mug down on the table very carefully, the clink echoing in the sudden tension. "So," I said, my voice quiet but steady, "I just sign it over, and we both pretend that's not exactly what you've been waiting for." Her smile faltered then, just slightly. "I didn't mean it like that," she protested, her voice losing its practiced cheerfulness. But I knew, and she knew I knew, that she absolutely did mean it like that. She just hadn't expected me to articulate the raw truth out loud. I stood up slowly and looked at her. Truly looked at her for perhaps the first time in years. The carefully applied makeup, the expensive designer handbag resting on the chair beside her, the way her phone vibrated every few seconds with urgent messages from clients. She looked the picture of success, of a life being built and managed with ruthless efficiency. But she didn't look like my daughter anymore. "I'm not giving you this house," I said, my voice flat, final. Her eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Mom, don't be ridiculous. It's just paperwork. It protects both of us." "Really?" I shook my head slowly, a sense of quiet resolve hardening within me. "No," I countered gently. "It protects you, and it erases me." The silence that stretched between us was so thin, so brittle. I could hear her sharp intake of breath, her subtle swallow. "I've been dying in pieces for a long time. Betty," I whispered, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. "Not from cancer. From you." She stood up then too, her face now registering anger beneath the confusion. "So that's what this is," she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "You're punishing me for being practical. I'm just trying to plan ahead. God forbid someone in this family actually thinks about the future, about long-term strategy." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped aside and opened the front door wide. She stood frozen for a moment, clearly stunned that I would even suggest, implicitly, that she leave my house. I said nothing, just held the door open, my posture signaling the boundary I was finally drawing. She finally grabbed her purse, shook her head in exasperation, and walked out without another word. I watched her walk down the driveway, her tires kicking up a small cloud of dust from the gravel path I had swept that very morning. When the sound of her car engine finally faded into the distance, I closed the door and locked it firmly. Then, I walked over to the couch and sat down, allowing myself a long, deep breath. It wasn't a sob, wasn't a breakdown, just a fundamental release. The kind of breath you take when something profoundly painful finally ends, and you know in your bones, with absolute certainty, that it is not coming back to haunt you in the same way. That night, I made dinner for one. It felt strange, initially, but I lit a single candle at the kitchen table. Not because I was celebrating some victory, but because I needed to remind myself, in a tangible way, that I still mattered, that my presence in my own life deserved beauty, even if there was no one else there to witness it. I didn't tell anyone about the confrontation with Betty, about her request or my refusal. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic social media post, no indignant phone call to a friend. But inside me, something profound and irreversible had shifted. The old version of me, the mother who had endlessly given, who had endlessly excused and minimized, had quietly packed her bags and left. Everyone else, I knew, would likely assume I was simply giving up after the diagnosis, that I was fading away, slipping into the inevitable decline, passively preparing for the end. But something else entirely was waking up inside me. Something quiet. Yes, but immensely strong and resilient. They thought I was walking away from Betty, from that dynamic, because I was weak, diminished by illness and grief. But the truth was far simpler, far more powerful. I had finally remembered that I had somewhere else to go, somewhere that existed independently of her expectations or needs. I don't recall the specific calendar date, only that it was a day consumed by rain. One of those steady, relentless downpours that seems to soak into everything. Your clothes, your skin, right down to your bones. The sky was a uniform, oppressive gray, the kind of gray that flattens the landscape and drains the color from the world. And I hadn't left the house in 3 days, lost in the gloom. My body ached. Not just the physical pain from the chemotherapy treatments, but from something deeper, something harder to articulate. The kind of ache that wraps itself around your spine and whispers, "No one is coming for you. You are truly alone." I had moved into the guest room by then. I simply couldn't bear to sleep in the master bedroom anymore. It held too many potent memories of Philip, too many lingering shadows of the life we had once so carefully planned together. The king-sized bed felt vast and empty now, the silence in the room deafening. The nightstand on his side still held the little reading lamp he used every night. I hadn't had the courage to touch it, to move it, afraid of disturbing the last physical trace of his presence. That morning, I sat by the window in the guest room, wrapped tightly in a blanket, watching the rain trickle down the glass pane like slow, sad tears. I felt too drained, too empty, to summon tears of my own. The garden outside, my once beautiful, thriving, blooming escape, was now tragically overgrown and neglected. The vibrant azaleas drooped heavily under the relentless weight of the rain and weeks of inattention. Weeds had crept relentlessly up along the edges of the stone path, reclaiming territory. I hadn't pruned a single bush or pulled a single weed in weeks. It was the first time I truly acknowledged how profoundly I had let things go. Not just the garden, but everything in my life. There were dishes piled precariously in the kitchen sink, a stack of unopened mail accumulating on the entry table, laundry still sitting in the dryer from days ago, forgotten and wrinkled. I had stopped answering phone calls, even from the kind nurse at the oncology clinic who checked in on me. The refrigerator was mostly empty, containing little more than a half-finished bottle of orange juice, a wilted bag of spinach, and a Tupperware container whose contents I couldn't even recall packing. I felt utterly irrelevant, completely invisible, dissolving into the quiet decay around me. The house no longer felt like a home, a sanctuary of life and memories. It felt like a waiting room, a desolate space suspended somewhere between living and not living. I had built this place, brick by brick, with my blood, sweat, and decades of unwavering sacrifice. But now, it felt like nothing more than an empty shell, one that everyone else was already measuring and planning for a future I would not be a part of. That day, I didn't bother getting dressed. I didn't brush my hair. I simply sat by the window, lost in thought, contemplating what it truly meant to disappear slowly. Not in a dramatic, tragic way that would make headlines, but quietly, subtly, like a page in a book being erased one letter at a time. My gaze fell upon the photo album on the side table, the one Betty hadn't asked about or shown any interest in. Not once. I reached for it and slowly flipped through the pages. Photos of Philip holding a tiny Betty at the beach. Betty in her first awkward ballet recital costume. Me in the hospital room after she was born, exhausted but smiling radiantly. There we were. A family, seemingly real, seemingly whole. And yet now, none of it felt like it had been substantial enough to last. To endure. I pressed my palm gently against one of the photos. Betty, around age 10, a gap-toothed smile, hugging me fiercely, as if I were her entire world, and whispered to the image, "Where did you go?" The photograph offered no answer. Later that afternoon, I made a half-hearted attempt to eat, to regain some strength. I made some toast, took one bite, and couldn't force myself to swallow it. My stomach twisted with a sickening combination of nausea and grief. They had become indistinguishable. Two sides of the same coin of pain. I walked into the living room and simply collapsed onto the couch. I curled into myself, clutching a decorative pillow to my chest, like a life raft in a storm, trying to hold myself together. For the first time since receiving my diagnosis, the thought formed in my mind with chilling clarity. Maybe I've already died. Maybe this is what being forgotten feels like. That thought, more than the prospect of physical death, truly scared me. Not the cessation of life, but erasure. The terrifying prospect of being alive, physically present, and yet already mourned, already replaced in the minds of those I loved. The rain continued to fall steadily outside. The light in the room remained off, plunging me deeper into the gloom. I didn't move from the couch. At some point, the power flickered briefly. The television set came on for a moment, filling the silent room with a burst of crackling static before shutting itself off again. That brief, jarring sound startled me out of my stupor. It reminded me, sharply, of what the overwhelming silence had swallowed. My own life. And that's when the realization hit me with the force of a revelation. This wasn't just sadness anymore. This was surrender. I had reached the edge of something. Not the kind of dangerous edge you fall blindly from, but the kind you either consciously step away from, turning back towards life, or consciously step off, choosing to disappear. It depended entirely on whether or not you could remember who you were. And in that moment, shrouded in darkness and damp air, I knew I had forgotten. And Betty, lost in her own world, wasn't going to remind me. No one was. If I wanted to matter again, not to Betty, not to the world outside, but to myself, I would have to climb out of this dark hole, brick by painful brick. I would have to painstakingly dig myself back into existence. Not because someone was waiting for me to return, but precisely because no one was. And somehow, strangely, that stark realization didn't break me further. It steadied me, provided a strange kind of resolve. I didn't fully understand it then, but that was the bottom. Not death, not despair, but simply the quiet, unwavering decision that I could no longer sit by the window, wrapped in a blanket, waiting passively for something to happen, waiting for someone to save me or notice me. If I wanted life, whatever was left of it in the face of my illness, I would have to actively take it back for myself. It began the next morning, not with a dramatic bang, not with a sudden, triumphant burst of energy or miraculous healing, but with something small, almost imperceptible a decision, quiet and unspoken, made solely for myself. I made tea instead of my usual coffee. I walked over to the windows and deliberately opened the blinds, letting the weak morning light flood the room. I turned on music, not the grim news reports or the endless, disheartening chatter of the world outside, but Nina Simone, her powerful voice filling the space with the defiant optimism of feeling good. The irony of the song choice wasn't lost on me, but I played it anyway. I didn't dance, not yet. My body was still too weak, but I tapped my finger on the counter in rhythm as the kettle hissed and whistled towards boiling. And that, I realized, was something. That was new. Philip's letter had remained in the pocket of my robe all night. I had pulled it out and reread it 3 times before finally drifting into an uneasy sleep. Each time I read his words, they seemed to land in a different place inside me, reaching parts that had felt numb and deadened over the years. Places I had thought the cancer, or perhaps just life, had finally extinguished. But they hadn't. Not yet. The next small decision came mid-morning. I went outside. It was the first time I had stepped out of the house in weeks. The air was cool and damp, still heavy with the lingering moisture from the previous night's relentless rain. And my garden, my once cherished sanctuary, was in even worse shape than I had remembered. The azaleas, once so vibrant, were heavy with rot and decay. The aggressive mint had completely overtaken the more delicate basil. Weeds poked stubbornly through the cracks in the stone path, asserting their claim over the neglected space. Still, I stepped barefoot into the soft, damp dirt of a flower bed. I didn't bring gloves or pruning shears or any tools whatsoever. I didn't come out to fix anything. I simply came to be in it. I felt the cool, yielding earth beneath my bare feet, the damp air on my face, the quiet, persistent pulse of the world still spinning around me, indifferent to my internal struggles. I closed my eyes and, for the first time in a long time, said out loud, clearly and firmly, "I'm still here." No one else was present to hear it, but I did. And in that moment, that was enough. That afternoon, on a sudden, inexplicable impulse, I called a local sailing club. I didn't fully understand why I was doing it. Perhaps it was prompted by the dusty travel magazines I had glimpsed in the attic, or the old photograph of Philip wearing his boating cap. Or perhaps it was a direct echo of that powerful line from his letter, "Go do something bold," even if no one understands. A woman named Marie answered the phone. She had a warm, welcoming voice and a gentle southern drawl that reminded me instantly of my own mother. "I'm 60 years old," I said, my voice slightly hesitant. "Is that too old to learn how to sail?" She laughed, her rich, genuine sound. "Honey," she replied warmly, "I've got a 72-year-old retired nurse taking lessons right now. Age don't scare the sea, or us. You coming in tomorrow?" I paused for a moment, a sense of both fear and exhilaration bubbling up inside me. And then, to my own surprise, I heard myself say, "Yeah, I am." I didn't tell Betty about the call. I didn't tell anyone. That was a crucial part of this quiet awakening, the profound realization that I no longer owed explanations, or even information, to people who had ceased to ask how I felt in the first place. The next day, I found myself standing on a sun-drenched dock, wearing borrowed boat shoes that were slightly too big and an oversized, bright orange life vest that felt cumbersome and unfamiliar. The instructor, a man in his 50s, with wind-chapped cheeks and kind, sun-faded eyes, patiently showed me how to tie a basic bowline knot. My fingers felt clumsy and fumbled with the thick rope at first. The rope felt foreign and resistant in my hands, as if I were attempting to master an entirely new language with my fingertips. But something about the process, the rough texture of the rope, its firm resistance, the quiet, rhythmic sound of the water lapping gently beside the dock, began to bring me back to life. I had spent so many years, so much of my energy, caring for everyone else, constantly worrying about being needed, about being useful, about fulfilling the roles others expected of me. But on that boat, learning to tie a knot, feeling the gentle sway of the water, no one needed me. And for the very first time, I didn't feel lost or purposeless. I felt undeniably, exhilaratingly free. Over the course of the next few weeks, I returned to the dock again and again, drawn by a force I couldn't fully explain but felt deep in my bones. I learned the fundamental skills: how to hoist a sail, how to read the shifting patterns of the wind on the water's surface, how to balance my weight against the unpredictable movement of the boat. I discovered a world where age didn't seem to matter, where the sea didn't care what stage of life I was in, only whether I could handle the ropes and read the compass. I met other women my age who laughed loudly and unapologetically, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their spirits unbound. I befriended a retired chef who now lived happily in her van, chasing the sun, and a widowed professor who spent his days writing terrible, wonderful poetry and drinking strong coffee on the deck of his small sailboat. These people didn't see me as fragile or defined by my illness. They didn't talk about wills or what happens next, or the practicalities of death. They asked me what I wanted now, what I dreamed of doing with the life I still had. And slowly, tentatively at first, I began to find the words to answer. I started painting again too, badly, at first, like a child picking up a brush for the very first time, the colors bleeding together messily. But it felt good, honest, a raw expression of something long buried. I hung a small canvas I painted above my fireplace, a messy swirl of blue representing the sky over a jagged, uncertain green shoreline. It didn't look like anything a critic would admire, but it made me feel something tangible, something real. I hadn't felt that in a very long time. One morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, bald from the chemotherapy treatments. My eyes hollowed by fatigue and worry, my skin pale and translucent, and I smiled. Not because I thought I looked good, or recovered, or even remotely healthy, but because, finally, undeniably, I recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked tired. Yes, deeply tired. But she looked awake, alive, present. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't passively planning my life around other people's timelines or expectations, or shrinking myself into a smaller, more manageable version to fit into someone else's idea of my legacy. I was quietly, deliberately building something entirely for myself, something that didn't require anyone else's input or approval. This wasn't about rebellion against Betty or anyone else. It was about return. A return to myself, to the version of me Philip had seen and loved, to the woman who had once, long ago, dreamed of salt air and open water. And she, I realized with a surge of quiet power, was coming back. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not because I was afraid of their judgment or disapproval, but because it felt intensely sacred, like something precious blooming underground, too new, too delicate to be exposed to harsh light and careless, potentially dismissive voices. That's how it all truly started, the silent setup. There was no announcement, no dramatic declaration of independence, just a series of small, deliberate steps taken with quiet, unwavering intent. The first significant thing I did was meet with a lawyer. Her name was Angela, and she had kind, intelligent eyes and a direct, no-nonsense tone that I found myself appreciating more than I had expected. I walked into her office wearing the scarf Betty had given me for Christmas the previous year, the one with the subtle pattern of sailboats on it. Betty had probably bought it without much thought, seeing the pattern perhaps as a vague acknowledgement of my coastal town life. She likely thought it was a joke, a slightly silly gift. But now, I wore it with a sense of quiet pride and purpose. Angela sat across from me, listening intently, her expression neutral but engaged, as I explained exactly what I wanted to do. I told her plainly that I was planning to sell my house. I told her, just as plainly, that I had no intention of leaving it to my daughter. And I emphasized that I needed everything, drafted and executed in a way that was absolutely airtight. No loopholes, no accidental claims, no possible legal challenges down the line. To her immense credit, she didn't flinch, didn't ask invasive personal questions, didn't try to dissuade me or suggest I reconsider. "We'll draft everything strictly in your name only," she said calmly, her voice firm. "Full control remains with you. You can decide exactly where it all goes, down to the last penny and possession. No one else gets to write your ending for you." That sentence, "no one else gets to write your ending," resonated deeply within me and stayed with me for days. A quiet mantra of self-determination. Next, I called a real estate agent. Not Betty, of course. The thought never even crossed my mind as a real possibility. I found someone new, a younger woman named Kay, who had visible tattoos on her arms and absolutely no patience for superficial small talk. I liked her immediately for her directness and professionalism. She came to the house to do an initial walkthrough, clipboard in hand, assessing the property. "You've got a gem here. Lynette," she said, looking around with an experienced eye. "Are you absolutely sure you want to let this go?" "I'm not letting it go," I corrected her, a small smile playing on my lips. "I'm trading it in for something better." Kay grinned back, clearly appreciating my perspective. "Well," she said, jotting down notes, "I certainly like the sound of that." Over the course of the following week, we staged the house, depersonalizing it to appeal to potential buyers. I packed boxes quietly in the evenings after Kay had left, carefully folding away decades of memories without breaking down, without succumbing to the emotional weight of the task. Philip's photographs, his letters, his fishing gear, all were carefully placed into a sturdy cedar chest. Betty's baby shoes, the clumsy art projects she had made in elementary school, her high school graduation cap, all were gently packed into storage containers, not out of an overflowing abundance of current love, but out of a quiet respect for what used to be, for the history we once shared within those walls. Each night, after the packing was done, I would light a candle and sit by the window, planning. I spent hours researching used yachts online, studying the requirements for obtaining a boating license, looking up marina slips in coastal towns further south. I watched countless videos on how to set up a sailboat for single-person handling, read testimonials from solo retirees who had embraced life on the water. The prospect of this new life didn't scare me anymore. It invigorated me. In fact, the more I learned, the more truly alive I felt, my spirit expanding with possibilities. I began budgeting meticulously, calculating what I would make from the house sale, estimating how much I would need to live off comfortably, determining what kind of boat I could realistically afford and safely manage on my own. I wasn't being reckless or impulsive. I was being precise and deliberate. I didn't want a floating mansion. I wanted freedom. A vessel large enough for solitude when I craved it, but small enough to sail without needing anyone's permission or assistance. I also updated my will, a task that proved more emotionally challenging than I had anticipated, even with Angela's calm guidance. Writing Betty out of the will completely felt like ripping off a scab that had been attempting, however tentatively, to heal over a long-standing wound. But the stark truth was, she had already effectively walked away from me, emotionally and spiritually, long before I ever conceived of leaving her behind in a legal sense. Angela helped me draft a letter to include with the legal documents, a personal statement that would accompany the will. It was nothing angry, nothing bitter or accusatory, just a quiet statement of love, boundaries, and the reality of the situation. This house was built from my love, but genuine love is not a form of ownership or entitlement. I leave you memories held within your heart, not material possessions. May you one day grow into a version of yourself that truly understands the profound difference between the two. I signed the letter with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. At night, in the quiet solitude of my living room, I practiced tying various sailing knots, using lengths of rope I had bought at the hardware store. I learned the names of different winds, how to read complex weather maps, preparing for the practical challenges of life at sea. The neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind, standing outside on my porch, tying ropes around the railings like a madwoman. But I didn't care about their potential judgment. I was learning. I was moving forward. I was becoming the woman Philip had described, the woman I was meant to be. I told no one about these preparations, not even the kind women from my support group. They would have meant well, of course, but they would have worried, told me to be careful, reminded me of my illness, insisted that I needed help, that now, perhaps, was not the time to take such significant risks. But they didn't understand the fundamental truth. This wasn't a risk I was taking. It was a rescue. I was rescuing myself from a life that was slowly suffocating me. The "For Sale" sign, a bright splash of color against the familiar green of my lawn, went up on a Tuesday morning. By Friday, To Kay's delighted surprise and mine, I had received 3 strong offers on the house. By the following Monday, I had accepted 1 full price, all cash, with a fast closing date. Kay was absolutely thrilled, celebrating the quick sale. Betty still had no idea any of this was happening. I canceled our next scheduled Sunday dinner without explanation, sending a simple text message saying I wasn't feeling well. I turned off my phone for the first time in years, needing a period of complete disconnection. And then, I sat in the now half-empty living room, surrounded by the ghosts of unpacked boxes and the lingering scent of cinnamon. And I smiled, because for the first time in a very long while, perhaps for the first time in my entire adult life, I was actively building a life solely for myself, not centered around anyone else, not lived through anyone else. Just me, charting my own course. And I didn't need to say a word to justify it to anyone. The first ripple in the quiet pond of my new life came in the form of a text message from Betty. It arrived without a greeting, without any pretense of warmth or connection, just a sharp demand. A question tinged with suspicion as she felt control slipping from her grasp. "Hey, Mom, weird. I just saw your house listed online. Is that a mistake?" I stared at the screen for a long time, the simple words carrying the weight of her implied accusation, her assumption that something must be wrong, that I must be acting irrationally, then deliberately. I typed back a response that was equally brief and unambiguous. No mistake. That was all. 10 minutes later, my phone began to ring, Betty's name flashing urgently on the screen. I let it buzz on the counter twice, then a third time, until finally, silence returned. I realized, with a quiet sense of power, that I no longer owed her the courtesy of immediate urgency. I didn't owe her the comforting reassurance of being instantly available to explain myself. Not after everything. Eventually, predictably, she showed up at the house. I was on the back porch, barefoot, enjoying a peaceful morning, sipping my tea and watching the birds hop through the grass as the early sun stretched its warm light across the neglected garden. It was early, the world still quiet, the air soft and fragrant with the scent of magnolia blossoms. I heard the front door swing open. She still possessed a key, a symbol of a connection that felt increasingly fragile, followed by the sharp click of her heels crossing the hardwood floors. Then her voice, sharp and high with disbelief and thinly veiled panic. "Are you serious right now?" I didn't turn around immediately, simply took another slow sip of my tea and waited. Betty stormed through the house, her footsteps echoing, until she reached the back door leading onto the porch. She stepped outside, her arms tightly folded across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, tense line. "You're selling the house without telling me?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger. I finally turned to face her, my expression calm and measured. Her blazer was immaculate, her makeup perfect, a carefully constructed facade, but her face was tight, etched with confusion, and the dawning realization that her anticipated inheritance was slipping away, leaving her feeling threatened. "Yes," I said simply, my voice level. "I am..." "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What's going on? Are you hiding something from me? Are you dying faster than you said?" That question, so blunt and devoid of empathy, actually made me laugh. It was a short, dry sound, more exhaustion than humor, escaping me before I could stop it. "I'm not hiding anything. Betty," I replied, my gaze steady. "And I'm not dying. I'm living." Betty's eyes narrowed, searching my face, trying to find the familiar, compliant mother she thought she knew. "You always said you wanted this house to stay in the family," she accused, latching onto a past promise. I nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of her statement. "I did," I conceded. But then I realized that I was the only one who ever saw it as a home, as a repository of our lives and memories. You, Betty, you see it as a property line, a financial asset. She scoffed, clearly offended by my blunt assessment. "That's not fair." "Mom, no," I said softly, but with unwavering conviction. "What wasn't fair was sitting at your dinner table, listening to you and Nate casually discuss what you would do with my dining room, my home, as if I were already gone. What wasn't fair was you treating my life-threatening diagnosis like a mere real estate transaction, a logistical event marking the transfer of assets. You made it abundantly clear that this place meant more to you after I was gone than it ever did while I was still here." She looked away for a moment, her jaw visibly clenched, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. Her silence, in that instant, spoke volumes, confirming everything I had felt and feared. For years, I had tiptoed around her feelings, walked on emotional eggshells, softened my tone, bitten back the words that needed to be said, all in an effort to maintain peace and connection. But now, for the first time, the dynamic had shifted. She was the one on the back foot, exposed and uncomfortable. The balance of power, the unspoken rules of our relationship, were shifting beneath her feet. "I've already accepted a formal offer on the house," I stated calmly, delivering the final blow. "The closing is scheduled for 2 weeks from now, and I have made other definitive arrangements for my estate." Her eyes shot back to mine, wide with shock and disbelief. "What? What does that mean?" she stammered, her voice suddenly uncertain. "It means, Betty," I said clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation, "that I am not leaving this house to you." A beat of stunned silence hung in the air, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You can't be serious," she snapped, regaining some of her defiance. "After everything I've done for you, everything you've done," I interrupted, raising my eyebrows slightly, a touch of genuine incredulity in my voice. "Betty, what exactly have you done?" "You brought me a folder filled with legal documents before you offered me comfort or soup. You talked about the end of my life as if it were a completed event, while I was still actively in the middle of fighting desperately for it. You didn't hold my hand when I was terrified. You handed me a checklist of responsibilities." She stepped back, as if I had physically struck her, her face paling slightly. "You think I don't care about you?" she whispered, wounded. "I think," I said gently, my voice laced with sorrow rather than accusation, "that you forgot how to—" She didn't cry then. Not yet. But the hard, sharp edges of her voice began to crack, revealing a vulnerability beneath the professional armor. Her posture remained rigidly upright, but her words had lost their customary weight and certainty. She was unraveling quietly, slowly, in a mirroring reflection of the way I had privately unraveled alone in the dark months prior. But I didn't press the advantage. I wasn't standing there on the porch to punish her or inflict pain. I was simply, finally done being afraid of what would happen if I stopped catering to her expectations and started living for myself. "You raised me to be strong," she said finally, grasping for something familiar, something she understood. "I raised you to be kind, Betty," I answered, reiterating the truth I had recently discovered. Strength without kindness is not strength at all. It's merely armor, a barrier against genuine connection. And you have been wearing that armor for so long now. I don't think you even know who you are underneath it anymore. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer, caught between the urge to fight back fiercely and the impulse to simply surrender to the unexpected truth of the moment. In the end, she said nothing more, simply turned and walked away. The back door clicked shut behind her, sealing the boundary between us. And I, standing alone on the porch bathed in the morning sun, exhaled a long, slow breath. I hadn't realized how long I had been holding my breath, waiting for her approval, her attention, her genuine love, which had become conditional, complicated, and perpetually delayed. Now, I didn't need it. Not in the same desperate, fundamental way I once had. That afternoon, I walked down to the local marina and stood beside the boat I was planning to purchase. A modest, weathered, 40-foot yacht with scuffed sides and a name painted on its stern that I already planned to change the moment I owned it. The boat broker, sensing my interest was serious, handed me the keys and invited me to explore it alone. I stepped aboard carefully, placing my hands on the worn railing, feeling the texture of the aged wood. I closed my eyes and allowed the gentle, rhythmic sway of the dock beneath my feet to fill my chest with something unfamiliar and profoundly comforting peace. This wasn't an act of revenge against my daughter. It was an act of reclamation, a taking back of my own life, my own narrative. And I was just getting started. The day of the final walkthrough, the official handover of my house, arrived like any other day. Sunny, cloudless, deceptively ordinary. Kay, my capable and direct realtor, met me at the front steps, a clipboard tucked under her arm and a satisfied grin on her face. "They're doing their final walkthrough this afternoon, before signing all the paperwork," she announced cheerfully. "Everything's lined up perfectly. Wire transfers are already pending." I nodded, a sense of quiet finality settling over me, and looked at the house. My house. One last time. I saw the familiar blue shutters I had painstakingly painted myself every spring. The worn front door that had opened to welcome trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Chatty neighbors dropping by. Nervous first dates. The overwhelming weight of grief. Unexpected moments of pure joy. And everything else that had woven itself into the fabric of my life within these walls. Every single brick, every window pane, every floorboard held a piece of my history, a fragment of who I had been. But I didn't feel sadness or regret in that moment. I simply felt done. I walked through each room quietly, accompanying the buyers as they arrived. A young couple, clearly expecting their first child, their faces glowing with anticipation for their own future. They seemed gentle, soft-spoken, full of hope. She reached out and tenderly touched the fireplace mantel, already treating it as if it held meaning for them. He commented on the backyard's privacy, the beautiful way the sunlight poured into the kitchen in the morning. They saw a future here, a blank canvas for their own family story. I was leaving behind a past. Just as the buyers were leaving to head to Kay's office to sign the mountain of paperwork, Betty pulled into the driveway. I knew she would come. I had left her previous text messages unread, her calls unanswered in the days since our last encounter on the porch. I hadn't needed to formally block her number. I knew that my sustained silence could speak louder and more clearly than any lecture or explanation I might attempt to give. She stepped out of her car this time, without the usual symbols of her professional armor. No clipboard, no Nate by her side, no rigid posture. She looked tired, her shoulders slightly slumped, her steps uncertain. Her heels sank slightly into the soft ground beside the driveway. And for once, she didn't immediately correct her balance, allowing herself a moment of unsteadiness. She looked up at the house, then turned her gaze back to me. "You're really doing it," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper, a statement of dawning realization rather than a question. I nodded simply. "I am." She walked towards me, her pace slower than usual, hesitant. "You didn't even give me a chance to understand." I turned to face her fully, my demeanor calm, measured, and resolute. "You had years, Betty," I said gently but firmly. "You had years to understand. You just never asked." She flinched visibly at my words, as if struck. I reached into the small bag I carried and pulled out an envelope I had prepared. "This is for you," I said, holding it out to her. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted it. Inside was the letter I had drafted with my lawyer. Nothing cruel, nothing dramatic, just the plain, unvarnished truth. The kind that doesn't need to scream, but cuts deep nonetheless. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the lines of text. Her lips moved silently as she read the words. This house was never merely a transaction. Betty, it was built from my love and countless sacrifices, held together with years of patience and resilience, and filled with the kind of unconditional love that doesn't come with strings attached or expectations of ownership. I gave you everything I had, my time, my energy, my resources, and I asked for very little in return just to be truly seen and valued for who I was. This home is not a reward for outliving me. It is not a trophy for your patience or anticipation. You may inherit the stories and memories we made here, but you will not inherit the physical structure. I have chosen a different ending for myself. Live your life fully, Betty. I intend to live mine. She looked up from the letter, blinking rapidly, her eyes moist. You didn't have to do this. Mom, she said, her voice thick with emotion. No, I replied softly, my gaze unwavering. I didn't have to, but I got to. That is the fundamental difference. She shook her head slowly, perhaps trying to find the old, familiar rhythm between us, the one where I would inevitably soften, pull her into a comforting hug, reassure her, and make everything okay, even when she had hurt me profoundly. But that woman, that version of myself, was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more self-aware. You could have just told me what you needed from me, she said, her voice catching on a sob. "I did, Betty," I said gently, my heart aching for the years of missed opportunities. "I did, 100 different ways, over 100 different times. I just didn't use a megaphone or a legally binding document to say it." She sat down slowly on the front porch steps, clutching the letter tightly in her hand, and for the first time since she had arrived, I saw her without the defensive edges, the sarcasm, the practiced composure. Just my daughter, still flawed, still complicated, but suddenly, heartbreakingly human again. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small. I smiled, a genuine smile that reached my eyes. "Somewhere with waves and sky. Betty, a place where people don't talk about what they'll get when I'm gone, but listen to who I am while I am still very much here." You bought a boat," she whispered, the realization dawning on her face, a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. "You weren't kidding." "No," I said, my voice firm. I was never kidding about the dreams that mattered most. She looked down at the letter in her hands. "You know," she said, her voice low. Part of me always thought this house would just always be here. That one day I'd walk in and you'd still be standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea and some story about a bird in the garden. You mistook me for furniture, Betty," I said. Not unkindly, but stating a simple truth. Something stable, something permanent, something that would always be here waiting for you. But I am not furniture. I am a woman, and I am still vibrantly alive. She nodded slowly, the tears finally forming in her eyes. Real, genuine tears that traced paths through the minimal makeup. I didn't know how to be different. Mom, she confessed softly. "I know," I said, my heart a complex mix of empathy and distance. And that's precisely why I had to be. We sat in silence for a long moment, the air between us thick with unspoken history and newfound understanding. The birds chirped cheerfully in the trees. A gentle breeze blew through the leaves. I felt a profound sense of lightness. Not the emptiness of escape, but the expansive freedom of release. Eventually, she stood up from the steps. She didn't hug me. I didn't reach for her. The time for easy physical comfort felt, for now, gone. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said, her voice still soft. "I already have," I replied, looking out towards the horizon. She got back into her car and drove away, not angrily, not bitterly, but quietly, finally acknowledging the ending of one chapter, even as the next remained unwritten. And I stayed there, watching the road where she disappeared, feeling no regret, only a quiet sense of peace. Later that evening, alone in a nearby motel room, I signed the final paperwork. The house was no longer mine, but for the first time in years, perhaps in my entire life, I felt that I truly belonged to myself. 2 weeks after the closing on the house, I stood on the deck of my new home, a modest but undeniably beautiful 40-foot yacht I had proudly named Second Wind. The marina was peaceful that morning. Just a few solitary gulls wheeling in the clear sky, the soft, rhythmic creak of wood against wood as the boats gently swayed, and the soothing, constant slap of small waves nudging the hull. I wore a simple windbreaker against the morning chill and a worn baseball cap Philip had once left in our closet after a long-forgotten fishing trip. I now possessed my official sailing certification. My marina slip was paid for in full, and my belongings, the relatively small collection of possessions I had chosen to keep, were tucked neatly into the cabin below. The house was gone, the keys handed off to the new owners, the final documents signed and filed. And Betty, well, she hadn't called or reached out since the day of our confrontation on the porch. She hadn't needed to. Her silence, familiar in its absence, was a response in itself, one I had grown accustomed to, one I no longer feared or grieved over with the same intensity. But justice, I had come to understand through this long and painful process, doesn't always announce itself loudly or arrive with dramatic fanfare. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it arrives in ordinary, unexpected envelopes. It came to me in the form of a letter, not a heartfelt, handwritten note filled with emotion, but a corporate, plain-looking envelope bearing the logo of a publishing house I hadn't thought about or heard from in years. I received it at the marina office, where they had kindly allowed me to forward all my mail. Inside was a brief, businesslike note. Dear Mrs. Voss, we are pleased to inform you that the film rights to your late husband's unpublished manuscript, The Water Nose, have been acquired by Seabound Pictures LLC. A royalty payout from this deal, along with residuals from future streaming rights and distribution, will be issued directly to you as the registered literary heir. Please find and close the initial payment. Attached was a check, a surprisingly large one. For a moment, staring at the amount printed on the check, I couldn't breathe. I stared at it, my hands trembling slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Not because of the sheer amount of money, although that was significant, but because of the profound weight of what it represented. Philip's manuscript, the one he had painstakingly written the year before he died, the one I had found tucked away in a drawer, printed and bound but never actually submitted anywhere for publication. It had always felt too personal, too unfinished, a private piece of his soul. It was a story about a man and a woman who find solace and rebuild their lives together at sea after facing a devastating tragedy. Fiction, yes, but deeply rooted in the truth of our shared dreams. Philip had written it, I realized now, as a love letter to us, a quiet expression of hope disguised as a novel. After his death, grieving and overwhelmed, I had simply shelved it, unable to bear reading something so raw, so connected to him. But last year, during one of my sporadic attempts to organize my cluttered life, I had sent a single copy to a small, independent publisher on a whim, a completely impulsive gesture, just to see if anyone would even look at it. They hadn't responded, and I had honestly forgotten all about it until this very moment. I walked over to the edge of the dock, sat down on the weathered bench, check still clutched in my hand, my eyes fixed on the shimmering water, and I laughed. I laughed loud and full, a sound that felt entirely new and liberating, because this was the perfect, final poetic turn that the universe had decided I deserved. Betty had patiently, almost smugly, waited for an inheritance tied to square footage and property value, anticipating a comfortable windfall that would materialize precisely from my passing. But I hadn't just given away the physical house. I had quietly, legally, definitively redirected everything else. And now this, a completely unforeseen financial gift, a blessing from a past I thought was gone forever, was mine alone, untouched by her expectations or entitlement. It wasn't born out of spite towards her, but because some rewards, some forms of justice, were meant to be earned through survival, through resilience, not through passive expectation. The money meant I wouldn't just live aboard second wind. I would truly thrive. I could navigate to wherever I pleased along the coast, easily pay for the best possible medical care as needed, even take classes or embark on extended travels without constantly checking my bank balance or worrying about finances. I had security now. Yes, a tangible independence. But the real, profound justice wasn't merely the large check. It was the undeniable fact that Philip, both in life and in death, had seen me, had truly understood me, in a way Betty never had or perhaps never could. He had left me a final, unexpected blessing, a validation of my worth and resilience, whether he had consciously intended to or not. And now, his voice, his story, our story, rewritten as fiction, but rooted in our shared truth, would be heard by people across the world. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the deck of my boat, my legs crossed, Philip's manuscript resting on my lap. I flipped through the pages, his familiar words unfolding in the soft, golden glow. "The water doesn't forget," he had written in one chapter. "It just waits patiently for you to remember yourself." I closed the book, pressing it gently to my chest, and looked out towards the vast horizon, the boundary between sea and sky. There was no lingering bitterness towards Betty, no desire for further revenge, just a profound sense of balance restored. The kind of justice that doesn't need to gloat, it simply quietly restores what was lost. I could let Betty keep her spreadsheets and her meticulous plans for the future. I could let her chase her own particular kind of legacy, built on acquisition and material success. Mine, I knew now, was already written, not in property deeds or financial statements, but in ink and waves, in resilience and reclamation. The message came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was docked in the charming coastal town of Beaufort, North Carolina, sitting on the stern of Second Wind, sipping my coffee and watching the pelicans dive gracefully into the water in search of their breakfast. It had been 3 weeks since I received the unexpected publishing check, and 2 months exactly since I had last seen Betty standing on my porch. I hadn't actively waited for her to reach out. I honestly hadn't expected her to. In the quiet solitude of my new life, I had begun the slow, gentle process of mourning her absence, not with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet acceptance, the way one might mourn a cherished but irretrievable memory. But then my phone buzzed on the table beside me, displaying her name. The message was simple, hesitant. "Hi, Mom. I know I probably don't deserve a response after everything, but I've been thinking about things a lot. I read the letter you gave me again. I'm genuinely sorry. Would you let me visit you? Just to talk, no expectations, I promise." I stared at the screen for a long time, reading and rereading the short message. A part of me, the old, ingrained motherly part that had always softened towards her, that had always made room for her in my life and my heart, stirred within me, a flicker of residual hope. But the wiser part, the part that had learned the hard way to value myself and to love without losing myself entirely in the process, remained grounded, cautious. I didn't reply immediately. I needed time, a full day, to sit with her message, to examine its sincerity, to ask myself honestly if this was a genuine expression of remorse or just another subtle shift in strategy, another attempt to regain control. But something in her message did feel different. She hadn't asked for anything specific, hadn't defended herself, hadn't made demands. She had simply asked for permission to talk, to connect, without expectation. So, eventually, I texted her back, providing the name of the marina where I was docked and suggesting a specific time for a visit. She arrived wearing simple flats and a pair of faded jeans. There was no expensive designer handbag, no high heels, no meticulously applied makeup. She looked less polished, less performative, and somehow more real, like someone who had been humbled by experience, not humiliated, but simply humanized, stripped of her usual defenses. She stepped onto the dock cautiously, almost tentatively, as if afraid she might inadvertently break something sacred just by approaching my boat. "Hey," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Hey, Betty," I replied, equally softly. We sat together on the deck of Second Wind for a while without speaking, allowing the quiet of the marina and the gentle rhythm of the water to fill the space between us. The breeze off the water was kind and cool. The sky above was clear and vast. She looked around the boat slowly, her eyes lingering on the small potted plant I had placed near the helm, the stack of sea charts neatly piled on the table, the faded old book on navigation I had been reading. "You did it," she whispered, a sense of wonder in her voice. "You really did it, Mom." I simply nodded, confirming the reality she was finally witnessing. After another moment of silence, she added, her voice low, "I read Dad's manuscript. The publisher sent me a copy." That information surprised me. I hadn't thought she would be interested. "I had no idea he wrote like that," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. I cried a lot when I read it. Not just because it was beautiful writing, but because it made me realize everything I never saw. What you two had. Who you both were. Who you were before. Before I made everything about myself. She paused, gathering her thoughts, and for the first time she offered a genuine, heartfelt admission. "I was selfish, Mom," she said, her voice laced with regret. "I know that now. I treated you like a life raft, always there, always reliable, always keeping me afloat. But I never, ever considered that you were something that could drift away, that you had your own currents, your own direction. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve it. I just wanted to say that I see it now. I see you now." I watched her as she spoke, not as a mother desperately hoping for a long-awaited breakthrough, but as a woman making a quiet choice whether or not to allow a damaged bridge between us to begin, slowly, tentatively, to rebuild. After a moment that felt both long and short, I reached for the kettle, the familiar action grounding me. "Would you like some tea, Betty?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It wasn't a full reconciliation. Not yet. But it felt like something better, something more honest, a potential beginning, built not on forced forgiveness or buried resentment, but on the fragile foundation of truth finally acknowledged. That night, after she had left, after the sound of her car driving away had faded once more, I sat alone on the bow of second wind, wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the moon cast a shimmering path across the dark water. The wind was light, the tide steady, the boat swaying gently beneath me. I thought about everything that had been lost over the years, the comfortable predictability of my old life, the unquestioning bond with my daughter, the version of myself I had allowed to fade into the background. And I thought about everything that had been found. My own voice, my own strength, my own quiet determination to live fully. I had, in a sense, mourned the mother I used to be, the wife, the teacher, the homemaker, the tireless giver. All the roles I had worn so constantly, they felt like my very skin, making me believe they were the entirety of who I was. But they weren't. They were merely chapters in a much larger, more complex story. Selling the house hadn't been an act of revenge. It had been an act of profound release, letting go of the physical symbol of a life lived according to others' expectations, so that I could finally discover who I actually was beneath all those layers. A woman with salt in her lungs and the vastness of the sky reflected in her soul. A woman who had spent so long tethered to the land, fulfilling her duties, that she had forgotten she once dreamed of sailing free. The cancer, still present, still a part of my story, felt somehow less central, less like the main character in my narrative. I no longer feared death in the same way I once had because I was finally, truly, deeply, rebelliously alive. I thought about Philip, his prophetic letter, his enduring words, about Betty walking away earlier that day, her eyes teary, her voice quiet, stripped of her usual demands and defenses, about how sometimes, perhaps, the people we love the most can only truly meet us, truly see us, when we stop shrinking ourselves to make room for them in our lives. In the distance, the rhythmic flash of a lighthouse blinked slowly against the dark horizon, a steady guide for any ships lost at sea. I closed my eyes, breathed in the crisp, salty air, and whispered into the gentle wind, "I'm not lost anymore." This, I knew, with absolute certainty, was my second wind, and it was just beginning.